Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to wait a minute or so that people can come into the room. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. We still have some people coming into the room, so just a minute. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to our next webinar in the Back to Basics series, Uniform Guidance Encore presentation. We're happy to have you here with us today. Before I introduce our presenter, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so be on the lookout later today for an email containing a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides and other resources. This webinar will run 50 minutes with a 10-minute Q&A immediately following. If you have any questions for our speaker, please put them in the Q&A box located in the Zoom toolbar. To find that, hover your mouse over the top or bottom of your screen and a toolbar will pop up. This webinar is eligible for 1 hour of CPE credit. We will launch 4 polls throughout the presentation. To receive credit, you must answer 3 of the 4 polls and also complete the short evaluation you will receive afterwards. LSL is using a new CPE system, so please note that the evaluation email will be coming from LC Vista. Please allow up to 1 week to receive this email. If you're having trouble seeing the polls, try minimizing the Zoom screen, as sometimes the poll question pops up behind it. You may need to click and drag your screen around a bit to see. If you're using multiple screens, check each one as it may pop up on another screen. And if that doesn't work, you may need to disable your pop-up blocker. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Ryan Domino is a partner in LSL's Assurance and Advisory Department and has over 12 years of experience working with government agencies. His primary area of expertise and focus is researching auditing and accounting standards, including GASB pronouncements and the federal uniform guidance, in conducting the audits of special districts and mid-sized cities. He also earned the AICPA's advanced certification for the planning and execution of single audits. Ryan oversees engagements for a variety of governmental clients, providing accounting guidance and other services, including audits, consulting, and other agreed-upon procedures, an act for preparation with high level of care and precision. Ryan is also a regular speaker at LSL's annual GAT update on technical topics and is responsible for overseeing the Government Services Department's annual audit trainings. Okay, Ryan, take it away.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the introduction. Glad to be back with you all. Normally, I'm kind of behind the scenes in these webinars, so it's kind of fun to be out in front of the camera and talking to you all about a topic that is very near and dear to me, which is the uniform guidance. So we have a lot to cover today. It's a pretty broad topic. There's a lot of changes that have taken place that I'm not really going to be able to get into the details of today. So really, this is kind of an overview webinar. If you have specific questions regarding the stuff, you're always welcome to put it in the chat after, and I'll try to get to it at the end of the webinar today, or you can always reach out to me separately outside of this and shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to respond to it. Just one thing about questions, like Rachel mentioned before, if you have them, please put them in the Q&A box. Normally, I'm behind the scenes answering these questions, so I don't have that luxury today. So I will do my best to answer as many as I can. But if I don't get to your question, it's nothing personal. But you can always email me afterwards, and I will do my best to answer it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the uniform guidance here. So this is my old picture. If you're interested, always good to look at stuff that's a couple years old, but we'll skip over that. So I mentioned before that the uniform guidance has undergone a fairly significant revision. The first revision in over a decade, in fact, and it's the most significant revision since it's come out. So On April of 2024, the OMB pretty much finalized all of the revisions that are taking effect, and there's a lot of things that happened here. There's changes to subrecipient monitoring, reporting, all that stuff. The previous revision that happened about 10 years ago was really impacting procurement, which underwent another revision in this one. So this 2024 revision is significantly greater and broader in scope than the last one. So like I mentioned, I'm not going to be able to get to everything in detail, so it'll be kind of an overview today. So the effective date when these revisions took effect was October 1st of 2024. Basically the start of this past fiscal year for most of us who have June 30 year ends. And this applies to any newly issued federal awards. So any grants that are dated after October 1st, 2024 are subject to these new revisions. The awards issued that happened prior, that are dated prior to October 1st, 2024, it's possible they may still be affected, but for the most part, retroactive enforcement of those grant programs is generally prohibited, and they can't always do that except under certain circumstances. So one thing to keep in mind as you're going through this, if you're applying for a grant now and you haven't signed that grant agreement, when you do get that grant signed and it's finalized and all that stuff, it's going to be subject to these new revisions. However, any of your agreements that are dated prior to October 1st, you're still going to follow whatever guidance was in effect at the time of that grant award, unless the agency that gave you the award reaches out to you and it explains that they want to enforce these new provisions. And if they do that, they have to basically spell it out exactly what they're looking for. They can't hold you, non-compliant because of stuff that you did last year that wasn't subject to it, and they want to enforce it going forward. So one thing to keep in mind, I guess, if you walk away with nothing else from this, is that your old grants, if they're not subject to this, but if the agency reaches out to you and says they would like to enforce it going forward, anything that was older, they can't really hold you accountable for. So the first update that happened really is at our federal agency level. So the first thing that the federal agencies have to do as of October 1 of last year is they have to update their notices of funding opportunities. The notices of funding opportunities that are active on grants.gov, where we go to search out open awards, apply for funding, that type of thing. The agencies have to update all of those awards that are on this website. If they don't update it, then the agency itself is out of compliance. So there's really not much more for us as grantees to do here outside of be aware that the federal agencies are supposed to update this, but even if they don't update it, those awards are still subject to it. So there is one thing, that we have to do is just make sure that, we're aware that we have to comply with any of the new compliance requirements, even if those federal agencies don't update it specifically for those grant awards on this website. They're supposed to, but it doesn't necessarily let us off the hook. The one change here that could impact us, though, is where we may have to submit revised budgets. Typically, grantor agencies request as part of your submission package that you provide a budget of what you would use the grant funding for. If you provided this budget prior to October 1st of 2024, but you were not awarded the grant as of now, you may have to go back and revise your budget. The federal agencies may ask you to do that. Also, if you apply the de minimis indirect cost rate as part of the budget, that has had a significant change. It went from 10% to 15%. So if you use that calculation at all in the budget, you're likely going to have to resubmit your budget before you will get the award granted to you. So that's kind of I guess the main takeaway here is make sure that, if there's a possibility that your budgets would have to be revised if you have not actually gotten that grant awarded to you yet, but you started the process before October of last year. So that brings us to our first polling question. Just by way of reminder, if your polling question does not instantly pop up on your computer, you may need to check behind some windows. But is your organization usually subject to single audit requirements? Simple yes or no question. And while you all are going through that, I'll move on. So the first area that the uniform guidance changed was period of performance. So period of performance, well, if you will recall the last time the federal uniform guidance went through an update, they changed it to period of performance from period of availability. So they had a little bit of a terminology change there, but for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of change to the actual definition. This time around, with the new uniform guidance update, the definition has changed. So now the period of performance excludes estimated start and planned end dates. And the official definition is the specified time interval between the start date and end date of a federal award, and it may include one or more budget periods. So essentially what this is saying is that the grant awards that you have now is going to have a start date and it's going to have an end date. And if you have funding left over, basically, let's say you submit a grant budget and you haven't completed that budget, you have funding left over, you don't get to continue on with that funding. Essentially, the funding dries up after that. So the key thing is, you try to have your budgets align with the period of performance, so that way there's no overlap. But essentially, they are kind of implementing a little bit of a cost saving measure here. And I think that'll be kind of a theme you'll see through these changes, is that the federal government's emphasis with this update is cost savings. You're going to see that they are really trying to either not provide as much funding, find ways to claw back funding, et cetera. So this is one of those measures where if your approved budget ends next year, and that's part of the period of performance, then that's it. There's going to be, you can't do any further draws on it, essentially. So that's kind of the first big change that happened here. The next big change is question costs. So question costs have always been part of the uniform guidance. However, this time around, they've added some additional clarifications here. So previously, the question costs, if you ever went through a single audit and maybe you had some findings with respect to some allowable cost principles, some of the samples that the auditor took, typically the question costs here would be the actual costs that the auditor thinks were not compliant with the terms and conditions of the grant agreement. The uniform guidance update, though, has expanded this definition. So it's not just clearly non-compliant costs anymore, but now auditors are required to report on potentially non-compliant costs. So this is stuff that not only is it confirmed non-compliant, but it could potentially be non-compliant. So there's a little bit of judgment that has entered into the equation here. Expenses that, even if they're compliant, are poorly documented. So if there isn't enough evidence to back up the purpose for the cost, making sure that it was in accordance with the terms and conditions of your grant agreement, this could be a significant issue. As well as unreasonable expenditures. So again, we have judgment coming into play here that the federal government is asking of your auditors is to really evaluate whether or not the costs that are charged to these grant programs are reasonable. So again, this is kind of looking at that cost saving measure where they want not only to evaluate definite non-compliant costs, but maybe they're totally fine, but could you have done it in a cheaper way? Essentially is what they're trying to get at here. One area that I think that I would advise as an area to look at, and highly likely to be where most question costs would potentially come from, is payroll. A lot of payroll I've seen over the years is charged to grant programs on the basis of an allocation. So what I would strongly encourage you all to do is if you are charging any sort of payroll cost to that grant program, make sure that there is a clear trail showing that this employee who worked on this federally funded project charged those hours to it, and that it's supported by timesheets or some other reconciliation that clearly demonstrates that that employee did charge time to it. If you use an indirect cost allocation plan, that might be a different story. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of change there. Some change, but not a tremendous amount. But for any direct payroll costs, I would strongly encourage you to make sure that there are controls and procedures in place to make sure those are documented well. So that's the definition of question costs. There are types of question costs that we now have to report on. One is our specifically identified costs. So if, by way of example, if I'm your auditor and I'm reviewing your CDBG grant program expenditures and I come across a cost that is specifically excluded from CDBG, but it was charged to that grant, then that would be an example of a specifically identified question cost. I would have to report that in the auditor's report, essentially, as we believe these costs to be unallowable. However, the new one is your estimated costs. So this is where, let's say I take a sample of 20 transactions, and of the 20, 2 or 3 of them are not allowable. I have to now extrapolate that rate of error to the total population of costs. So you could see your question costs actually kind of not just the actuals, but also an estimate of what the error rate is in the total population. So sorry to use sampling terminology. I'm kind of a math geek, but know that there's going to be specifics and estimated costs are now included within this definition. And then finally, we have a new requirement as auditors that we have to not just report the total dollar value, but we have to provide an explanation in our audit reports as for what those question costs are. We have to explain not only what they are and the reasons for them, but also provide context about whether or not this is an estimated cost based on extrapolation of an error, or if it is what we believe to be a isolated incident or something along those lines. The federal government is looking for a lot more information regarding these types of items. So the next area that changed is actually kind of a little bit to our benefit as grantees. So previously, when we submitted a budget to the federal government, there was, that was it. You got your grant award based on the budget. Based on the cost, principles that changed here on October 1st, if there was a possibility to resubmit our budget, that is now allowed. So basically, the federal agencies can negotiate with you about budgets, and there will be a slide in a little bit where we talk about how this can specifically benefit you with respect to program income. But just be aware that going forward, if you do submit a budget under a new agreement, it's possible that the federal agency could come back and try to renegotiate that with you. However, it also gives you, as let's say you're a prime recipient and you have subrecipients, it gives you the right to also renegotiate with your subrecipients any contracts. So if you're trying to save costs as well, or claw back some of that funding for your own purposes, the new uniform guidance does allow that. So the accountability and cost sharing, we had some further definitional changes here. So one thing you'll notice in the new uniform guidance, as opposed to the older version, is there's a lot more emphasis on performance and results and accountability. A lot of grant programs previously just had a strong emphasis on you would submit a financial report showing the money that you received and the money you spent, and maybe what it was spent on, but that is kind of about it. Some grants had other types of reports that had to go with it, but for the most part, it was weighted very heavily towards financial reporting. The new uniform guidance is a little bit less concerned in the reports that you're going to be submitting to your federal agencies about the financial metrics and more so on the performance and the results. The government is a lot more interested in determining whether or not the funding that they're providing for these programs is actually being successful. So what you're going to see a lot more of in terms of requirements is performance reporting, where we're almost providing narratives about what we've accomplished with this grant funding. How, for example, the area that I probably know the best is housing and urban development. That's the grants that I see the most of. So to use them as the example, if you received the housing voucher cluster, the Section 8 grant program, if that's a major grant of yours, a lot of the reports now are going to be like, okay, well, how many participants in the program from the prior year? Is the housing quality improving? Things like that is what you'll probably see going forward. What they've kind of eliminated is from a codification standpoint, financial reporting is not necessarily going to be required by the uniform guidance. Now, this doesn't mean that your federal agency can't ask you to do it. It's still a option that they can require of you. However, they are no longer required to demand financial reporting from you. So that is a little bit of the difference here. And of course, the record retentions are now much more mandatory. We have to keep our records for a certain number of years to ensure that we're compliant with those two sections if you're interested in looking them up. One other area that has been updated, or I wouldn't necessarily say updated, but that it's really been codified now. So there has always kind of been, as part of our grant agreements, a provision that you cannot use one grant program necessarily to subsidize or do your cost sharing match of another federal program. This pretty much just codifies that. It's a practice I think we've all been pretty much doing. I've never seen a grant agreement that didn't have some sort of prohibition against using one federal program to be the match for another federal program. However, this section of it was never codified in the UG, so what we're seeing is that it is codified going forward. So the next one is our program income and certification. So there's a little bit of something here that we need to talk about with respect to program income. Actually have designated an entire slide for it. But basically what it's defined is it makes us, it clarifies that fixed amount awards, which is most of our grants, they're going to generate some sort of program income. That's the expectation now. They've also clarified the usage of this program income. So we have to make sure that we are using it in accordance with the federal award terms. There's a little bit of a stronger emphasis on that now, as well as we have to do a lot more certification requirements. So as we're reporting to our federal agencies, we're going to have to do certification of project completion. So if we complete a project that is federally funded, more likely than not, there's going to be some avenue to certify that the project was completed. The agencies are going to start being required to ask you to identify any incomplete activities that were originally agreed to in the grant agreement. There's going to be a certification that all the expenditures that were incurred under that grant agreement align with the uniform guidance. And then finally, any unexpended funds that you have left over at the end of the agreement may be retained if the activities are substantially completed as agreed. So this is actually a new one, and it's a benefit to us as grantees. So for example, if we get $1 million grant program and we expend $900,000 to complete this program, and when we submit our certifications and our performance reports and the federal agency is satisfied that we have fully completed those agreements, that the project is completed and they're happy with the results, the agencies could let you keep that leftover $100,000. Whereas before you would have had to give it back, now you may have the option to retain it. So that's kind of a nice upgrade here over the old terms and conditions where you definitely had to give it back, but now you can negotiate with the agencies to keep it, and they have the option to let you keep it if they're satisfied with the results of the grant program. So let's move on to reports and approval. I mentioned before that the reports are going to be much more performance driven than before. It's less focused on the financial metrics. But there are a couple of things that you may need prior approval from your federal grantor agency before you can start the process. One is your grant budget. I think we all kind of knew that when you apply for a grant, you typically have to submit the budget, and that is going to be subject to approval before you get the grant agreement. So that kind of remains unchanged. However, the one that's new and has changed a little bit is our sub awards. So if you pass through any funding to a subrecipient, again, I'm picking on HUD just because it's what I'm probably most familiar with. Let's say you get some CDBG funding or some home funding, and you pass through that to Habitat for Humanity or some other not-for-profit. You may need to submit that sub-recipient agreement to your grantor agency for approval if that sub-award is up to $500,000. So it may not be mandatory. It's going to be up to the federal agencies if they want to see this, but just be aware that you may have to start submitting these sub-recipient agreements for prior approval before you can enter into those agreements. So additionally, we had some whistleblower protections that happened. So if you're in California, the chances are you're probably already compliant with this requirement. I think it's California labor law that basically you have to have this little sign in the break room, right? That basically says if you're a whistleblower as an employee, you're protected from any sort of discharge or demotion or discrimination if you blow the whistle on improper activities. So for the most part, if you're a California agency, you're probably already compliant here. There's probably not much more to do. However, if you're not, and this is not a requirement in your state or jurisdiction, you're going to have to start communicating to your employees that they are protected from any sort of discrimination if they blow the whistle with respect to a federal contract or a grant, if they find any waste of federal funds or abuse of authority, violations of law, rules, or regulations, or any sort of substantial or specific danger to public health or safety as connected to a grant program, the employee needs to know that they're protected and they can't have any sort of discrimination against them based on that blowing of the whistle. The key thing here is that there is a notification requirement. So most organizations will have, like I said, a signage in the break room or somewhere else. You could communicate it in the employee handbooks or something like that. And then I'm not sure if you have remote employees, but if you have any remote employees, they would have to be communicated to as well. So just make sure that everyone is aware of the fact that if they come across any sort of any sort of misconduct with a federal grant, that they are protected as a whistleblower. So let's go to our second polling question. In your last single audit, how many major programs did you have? 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more? And while we're doing that poll, we'll continue on. So the other area that kind of received a pretty significant overhaul was our internal controls and cybersecurity. Now, internal controls have always been a part of the uniform guidance. The uniform guidance very clearly states that recipients of federal award programs have to establish and document and maintain effective internal control over federal awards. That part is completely unchanged. Whenever your auditors perform a single audit of your federal awards, they look at not only the compliance of those programs, but also your internal controls over the compliance of those programs. So that part has not really changed. The emphasis, though, has become greater. So that's a key thing. But also the update to the uniform guidance now includes controls addressing cybersecurity. Before, cybersecurity wasn't necessarily specifically spelled out, but now it is. So I did this presentation, I think it was about 2 weeks ago for CAPCOA, which is an air pollution control group. And I asked them, I did a little informal poll, how many of you have had a cyber attack of your organization in the last, 2-3 years? And it was actually unanimous. Every single organization represented in that room had some sort of cyber attack or attempted data breach over the last couple of years. So the emphasis has really shifted not only from like are our documents reviewed and approved by a supervisor, but do we have effective cybersecurity controls to really protect the sensitive information? Let's keep in mind that a lot of our federal programs, a lot of the participants in the federal programs, there's personally identifiable information in it. Again, picking on HUD, the Section 8 program, you have people's addresses, names, social security numbers. You have bank account information in there for the participants in these programs. So as organizations with access to that information, it's very important that we have safeguards in place to make sure that people's information is not leaked out and used for malicious purposes. This is particularly important and impactful for the private sector, particularly in the defense industry. So obviously the defense industry, we have national secrets in there, national security risks, a lot of program data. So what they're really looking for is not only us as local government, but really anybody who is receiving federal funding, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector, really have strong cybersecurity to safeguard not only the use of the federal funds, but also the program data. So what we should be doing as organizations is really taking a fresh look at our internal control structure with respect to our grant management strategy. We need to make sure that we have a good grants management strategy for starters, that we have maybe clearly defined control environment, control activities, that we're performing risk assessments regularly to make sure that our grant strategy can be accomplished, as well as monitoring internally just to make sure that we are actually accomplishing those objectives of our grants. And one thing to consider too is make sure we have a written policy and procedure in place that really addresses cybersecurity. Are we doing penetration testing regularly? Do we have appropriate firewalls in place? Is there any way that grant related information could somehow be compromised? So that's one thing I would encourage everybody to do just going forward, is really take a look at these internal controls. The emphasis on them is only going to get heavier as we live in a much more digitized world. So I mentioned before that program income had some clarifications, and this one is honestly kind of a bummer. It's one of the cost saving measures that I mentioned before, but basically now we have to assume the deduction method for program income. So the deduction method, by way of example, essentially says that if you get $1 million grant, just by way of example, and you're earning program income on those draws, the program income is essentially going to go against your total amount available to draw down from. So let's say you draw down $500,000 of that million. It earns, we'll just say $10,000 of program income. Then your total amount you're available to draw from the federal agency now is $990,000. So any program income is going to be taken into account and not able to be used in addition to the drawing down that million. So that's a little bit of a departure from before. wherein if you earned, let's say, $10,000 in program income, your total award amount would now be $1,010,000. You could add it in and use it for the terms of the grant. However, now it reduces the total drawable amount. So unless it is specifically stated in your grant agreements, terms and conditions that it is not the deduction method, you have to assume that the deduction method is going to be used. So how do we handle any program income earned after the performance period? So if we conclude our grant, we close it out, and we earn some program income, the uniform guidance doesn't specify any handling requirements. Typically, it's going to be subject to your agency's regulations or the award's terms and conditions. So whether or not you have to give it back or you can keep it is going to be spelled out in your grant agreement. I mentioned before that negotiation is a new thing that can happen with our federal agencies. So during the closeout process of the grant, there's a little bit of flexibility here now. So under the old terms and conditions of the uniform guidance, if you earned more than $500 in program income that was unused and not put back into that grant, you had to basically give that money back. Now that's not necessarily the case. There can be a negotiation process with the federal agency. They can look at your situation. Did you do the grant? Did you not do the grant? Based on your discussions with them, they may actually let you keep the program income. So that part is pretty good. You may have an opportunity to keep program income, whereas before you definitely would have had to have given it back if there's excess after the closeout of the grant. So another area that changed was our procurement. I mentioned before that the last update to the uniform guidance really touched heavily on procurement. This time around, it touched on it again. So this is actually a great opportunity. If you have an old capitalization policy, check it out. This is a good time to update those thresholds to be compliant with the uniform guidance. So basically, their capital asset threshold increased from $5,000 to $10,000. So if your capital asset threshold is only $5,000, this is a grand opportunity for you to make your life a little bit easier when you're closing your books at the end of the year and update it to $10,000. For disposals, there is specific instructions in your terms and conditions now. They will now require you to dispose of equipment that you purchased with federal dollars when that equipment is no longer needed, and not necessarily when it's done being depreciated. So if you're depreciating it after over 5 years after you purchase it, but you're done using it after 3, you have to dispose of it at the 3-year mark. Additionally, when you do dispose of it, there are some rules about the proceeds. So if the equipment was valued at $10,000 or less, the federal agencies don't really care. You can keep it, you can sell it, you can dispose of it without any sort of obligations. You're good to go. However, if the equipment that you purchased is valued at over $10,000, the federal agency will likely attempt to claw back some of that proceeds. So depending on the terms and conditions of your grant agreement, you may have to remit some of the proceeds of that capital equipment back to the agency. Additionally, they do emphasize how maintaining controls over lost, damaged, and stolen equipment, and that there may be some sort of obligation if there is such happenings with federally funded equipment to reimburse the federal agencies for that situation that could have happened. It'll depend on what the circumstance is, but just be aware that it's good to have controls over your equipment purchased with federal funding, because if not, and something goes missing, you may be on the hook to reimburse them for that purchase. So supplies is the other area. So previously, anything under $5,000 was considered supplies. Now anything under $10,000 is considered supplies. So that's pretty consistent with the equipment threshold increase. The big change here, though, is what happens with unused supplies. So any unused supplies at the conclusion of the grant agreement. If you have over $10,000 worth of unused supplies, it is highly likely that the federal agency will require you to reimburse them for the unused supplies. So as you're managing the grant, it's really kind of important to make sure that we are, one, updating our policies for this supply threshold increase, but two, that we're only purchasing the amount of supplies that we think we're going to need, and we're really doing a careful inventory of the supplies on hand, so we're not buying more than what we need at the end of the day, because we may have to reimburse our grantors for any excess. So just by way of very quickly, we had some general procurement standards that were updated primarily to reflect allowable provisions for contracts and labor-related goals. Some other competition and procurement methods that were updated were in competition. So under the old guidance, geographic preference was often given more weight when you're going out for a procurement, right? So the idea was that you would be stimulating the local economy with the federal funding. However, the government, again, is trying to save some costs. And a way to do that is by opening up competition beyond geographic preferences. So if your procurement manual for federally funded contracts specifies a geographic preference, you do need to remove that. The uniform guidance is looking more on cost and performance rather than where your contractor is located. The other thing too is there were a couple of changes in terminology and streamlining of processes. So one process that got streamlined is as local governments, and we're no longer required to publicly open sealed bids. So I'm not sure if y'all were doing that before, but if you were, you don't have to do it anymore. Another terminology change is that small purchases are now referred to as simplified acquisitions, and that the micro purchases, so that definition is still the same, and then the now simplified acquisitions, these are now classified as informal procurement methods. So just a couple of definitional changes, as well as a couple of changes to the competition side of things. However, this does also impact our subrecipients. So if you pass through any funding to a subrecipient, there's now some things we have to do. I mentioned before that any subrecipient agreements that you are wanting to enter into up to $500,000 may be subject to your grantor agency's approval before you can enter into those agreements. So that's a possibility. However, there were some other things as well. As pass-through entities, it's our responsibility to make sure that we are amending our subrecipient agreements to comply with these changes. Our subrecipient agreements have to align with our primary agreement that we have with our grantor agencies. So we cannot ask our subrecipients to do things that our grantor agency is not asking of us. The other thing too is if our federal agency has not applied any revisions on our grant agreements, okay, so let's say we have an old grant that was issued to us prior to October 1st, 2024, and we issued a portion of that to a subrecipient for them to run with the program. We cannot apply the revisions to the uniform guidance to our subrecipient agreement if the federal agency that gave us the money in the first place hasn't applied them. So the key thing is to be consistent across the entire stream of the money, essentially. However, if our federal agency reaches out to us and say, hey, we're going to implement X, Y, and Z of the new provisions, you have to do this, then at that point, you can go to your subrecipient and say, hey, HUD or DOJ is asking us to do this now. We need you to provide us this to be compliant with them. So keep that in mind as you're going through it. The other thing that impacts subrecipients is suspension and debarment requirements. Apologize for the typo. Spell check is unreliable. It's supposed to be suspension and debarment, not suspension and department. So previously there's always been a requirement that subrecipients are not suspended from receiving federal funding prior to us giving them the federal funding. This was codified to be a little more clear, though, that the pass-through entities, so that's us, we may have to do additional steps to verify that our subrecipients are not suspended or debarred. In most cases, this kind of takes the form of like a self-certification. I see this a lot where there's a clause in the subrecipient agreement wherein the subrecipient affirms that they are not debarred or suspended from working on a federally funded project. That's still allowable, but it's not really the best. So my recommendation would be go to sam.gov, create an account if you don't have one. And then as you're considering subrecipients to provide funding to, all you have to do is search their name or their employee unique, or not employee, I'm sorry, the unique employer identification number. They'll come right up and there will be a little green bubble that'll show them whether or not they are clear to work on federally funded projects. For your documentation, if you're ever subject to a single audit, just take a little screenshot of that, drop it in their file, and you should pass with flying colors. So that's my free tip of the day on that one. So with that, let's go to our next polling question and continue on with subrecipients. So I mentioned before that our fixed amount subawards, the threshold for approval will increase from $250,000 to $500,000. We do have to comply with certain sections of the uniform guidance now. So it's referenced there if you want to take that deeper dive into it. And then the modified total cost subawards. So this is our what do you call it? The Transparency Act reporting. So that threshold increased from $25,000 to $50,000. So a little bit less legwork on the reporting side of things, which is kind of nice, kind of streamlining it a little bit. But we do still have to do some of this stuff. So let's talk a little bit about our indirect costs. The first one is our negotiated indirect cost rate agreements. So if you have a cost allocation plan that is negotiated with your federal agency, if you put it in place prior to October 1st of 2024, the agencies do have to honor that. However, they can renegotiate it after October 1st of this year. So just beware if you've submitted one of these, agencies could be reaching out to you to renegotiate those indirect costs. Any rates in effect prior to October 1st, basically they have to be reviewed and approved, but ultimately honored is what we're saying here. The biggest change, though, for indirect costs is our new de minimis indirect cost rate. So this has always been an optional thing. We've never been required to use the de minimis indirect cost rate. However, it went from 10% to 15%. So that's good. It allows us to add more overhead to our grant budgets. However, there are a couple of things we have to do if we're going to do this. One is we have to apply it to every grant award, whereas with a cost allocation plan, that's not the case. Two, there has to be adequate funds available in your grant to increase your budget if you wanted to do this. And then three, you would probably likely have to submit a revised budget for any old grants that haven't been awarded yet but the process for application started prior to that October 1st date. So this one's kind of nice, gives you a little more flexibility or a little more money that you can claim for overhead. However, the key thing is you have to apply it to all your grants, and there has to be enough funding within your grant program in order to use it. So some other costs that we have to be aware of and can start claiming on our Grant agreements is organizational costs, so things like data-related expenditures, evaluation expenses, evidence reviews, planning, conducting evaluations, cybersecurity measures. All of these are considered organization costs that we can start claiming in our grant budgets, which is kind of nice. The only thing we can't do is we cannot claim any costs that persuade or dissuade employees from collective bargaining. So I don't think that necessarily impacts too many governments, but just know you can't claim those kinds of costs. So with the few minutes we have left, just kind of want to talk about a couple of audit implications. One is our single audit threshold update. So I'm sure everyone's probably heard of this one. So for our June 30, 2026 fiscal year ends, if you're a June 30 year end, the threshold for single audit increased from $750,000 to $1 million. So that's kind of cool. And hopefully that means less single audits over the years. They did this because the number of single audits that they have been reviewing at the federal level has been astronomical over the last couple of years, particularly since COVID. Funding has really increased the amount of single audits that are out there. The federal agencies can early implement this too, so they can choose to implement some of these changes for as of June 21, 2024. I wouldn't expect to see too much of that, so probably not going to spend a ton of time here. However, like I mentioned before, they can't retroactively apply this stuff unless they talk to you first, essentially, is what it comes down to. But key thing is $1 million, June 30, 2026. The other thing that's new is the extension option. Previously, the single audit deadline was always 9 months after your fiscal year end. So for most of us who have June 30 year ends, that is March 31st, 2020 or 6 would be, our deadline this year. Now, starting last year, they allowed organizations to submit an extension. Now, my understanding is they're pretty stingy on these extensions. It's not going to be like the GFOA where you can get an extension and another extension and get it every year. The feds are going to be pretty particular about this. We have to make sure that the reason for the extension is clearly documented. It usually has to be like a disaster level type thing, wildfires, flooding, hurricanes, things like that, that really were significant and unavoidable and had a significant impact on the project activities. So if that's happened, you'll submit a request to your cognizant agency or your oversight agency and request an extension from them. This is new. A lot of organizations, I had a couple attempt to submit the extension last year. I believe only one actually got the extension due to fairly significant and unavoidable circumstances. However, a few others attempted to do the extension, and they were shot down because they did not provide the agency with enough notice, or they didn't feel like the reason was good enough. So I would advise you to, if you have a significant event that's happened, like a wildfire or something along those lines, get ahead of it. Let your cognizant agency know about the situation, and then try to get that request for extension in as early as possible. Okay, the last thing here for your grants, and this is kind of going to be consistent with when the uniform guidance first took effect. So if you were working in government about, what was it, 10, 11 years ago when the uniform guidance first took effect, you had OMB A133 was the standard for single audits. And then the uniform guidance took effect. And so any awards that were issued under A133, you still managed it in accordance with A133, and anything that took effect under uniform guidance fell under the uniform guidance. This is going to be true again. So any awards that were under the old uniform guidance, you still manage it the old way, and anything that came in under the new, you're going to manage it under the new way. So that's kind of going to be a bummer for probably the next 2 years or so, as those old awards are still cycling out. There could be some collaboration that you could do with federal agencies. They're going to outline specific requirements. They're supposed to assist you on any systematic changes. So if you have two awards, just different years, but essentially it's the same program, reach out to your agencies and just see how they would like you to consistently apply the changes or run it separately, things like that. Be evaluating your impact on internal controls and your processes to make sure that we're compliant with either the pre-2024 or post-2024 revisions. All right, so I said all that to say, as we wrap up here, some things you can do to make sure you're compliant going forward is, one, review the terms and conditions updates in the uniform guidance. CAFA, which if you Google, the CAFA crosswalk, it's a amazing little spreadsheet that will really redlines the changes from the prior uniform guidance to the new uniform guidance. They'll help you identify changes to your agency, assess your existing grants for any amendments, discuss it with your granting agencies as needed, revisit pending grant applications, make sure you're submitting anything that they might need to complete that application, review your policies, your subawards, your overall grant management. If you're doing any cost allocation plans or indirect cost rate, make sure that you're reviewing that for compliance as well. And then finally, really be coordinating with your auditors to make sure that we're all on the same page for the single audits, not only for 2025, but going into 2026 as well. So with that, let's launch our last poll of the day, and I'll start taking some questions. But before I do that, I just want to put a shameless plug for our next Back to Basics webinar on September 24th, where my partner Kelly Telford in our consulting and advisory department and Jamie Lambert, a senior manager in our assurance and advisory department, are going to be doing a GASB update on GASB's 102, 103, and 104. A lot of exciting changes coming down the pipeline, so make sure you tune in for that one. It's going to be a pretty awesome webinar, and I'm excited about that. So with that, let me go ahead and take a look at what's in our Q&A box and see if I can answer some questions here. Okay. So the first question is there a definition of reasonable? The definition of reasonable is going to be I would define it this way: what a educated third party looking in at the cost, who is not you, but also not your auditor, would they kind of look at that and say, you know what, I think that is reasonable as far as the program goes. So you definitely want to make sure we're taking into account, like, would somebody at my grantor agency think that this is okay, or would they not? That's probably the best way I would define it. Unfortunately, it's not like there's a 51% rule or something like that. It's very judgment based, and that's kind of the best advice I would give you on that. Okay, the next question is, can we bill the overhead cost allocation to the grant? I would say the answer to that is yes, as long as you have communicated that as part of the grant application process, that overhead is part of the grant budget. That's normally okay. If you're going to do the indirect cost rate, though, remember you have to apply that consistently across all grants. A cost allocation plan can be a little more specific to certain grants as opposed to others. Okay, next question. So does the budget negotiation mean that if the award was denied for budget, we can resubmit it until we get it right and get the award? That would be kind of my understanding. So essentially now, if you submit the budget, you should be able to negotiate with the grantor agencies and kind of come to an agreement on what they would like to see and what you're good with. Really, it's just to provide more flexibility for both parties. Essentially, is the heart of it, and primarily the federal government really is the main beneficiary of this, where a lot of times will say like, we don't like your budget. We need to work on this part or that part. But ultimately, yeah, I wouldn't say it would necessarily keep you from getting it, but you could potentially negotiate with them to get it right, so to speak. All right, can you explain the difference between program income and the federal award amount? So yes, so program income is basically the interest that you earn on draws from the federal award. So let's say you have you get this grant where you draw down, you know, so $500,000. It earns interest before you spend all of that $500,000. That interest gets netted against the total amount of what you could draw down on that grant, essentially. So what they're trying to do is make sure that if you're awarded $1 million, you only get $1 million, whether or not that comes from interest or draws, is I guess the key takeaway from that. And I apologize if I didn't explain it super well, but that's kind of the key thing. All right, with that, I see we are at time. I apologize. There are quite a few more questions in the chat. If you want to send me a follow-up, I'm more than happy to answer them. But I appreciate you all tuning in today, and I hope you have a wonderful day and hope to see you at the next webinar.